Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant. Today, I don't actually have a copy of the book that I'm going to be ranting about, and that's because I gave it to my ex, and she's a good drive away. I'm not going to be able to get the book on short notice, and it was a gift anyway, so yeah. But what I will say is the book is Wild Girls, and the subtitle is How the Outdoors Shaped the Women Who Challenged a Nation. And it was a really interesting book, but I thought personally it kind of failed at doing its job in a few particular ways. When I picked it up off the shelf at the bookstore in Mesilla Valley, where I also bought the book about the Gila Wilderness turning 100, I thought that what it was going to be about was more adventurous women. So I was thinking it would be something like Isabella L. Bird from A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains. Or perhaps it would be more about women such as those that were discussed in National Parks and the Women's Voice, which I still have because it's a good book. Though, like I said when I ranted about it, it is a very dry book. It's hard to read through, this one in particular. But I thought it was going to be about that the Wild Girls were going to be about, for example, the women that traveled to Yosemite when it was still just a California park and not a national park. Or that it would be about some of those anthropologists such as Alice Fletcher and Matilda Cox Stevenson. And what I got instead was a book about women throughout US history, some that did get a lot of media attention, and some that mostly escaped notice, especially in the modern era, but that had profound impacts in the worlds they were living in. And for example, they discuss how Harriet Tubman and a few other contemporaries learned about wilderness travel as young women and girls. How for Tubman, she was able to wander or learn enough herb lore and woodcraft that she could then eventually guide people through the woods at night to their freedom, to safety. And so in that case, it's the outdoors shaped her efforts to liberate slaves. And then it also discusses two other women, including one that I think was a Quaker. It's just really fascinating in that way. But then it also has stories that in a way feel like they should be well known and might be well known in certain circles. One that I really appreciated was about Fort Shaw, Montana, and I discussed recently in the Stories That Shape Us how some Native Americans, not all, but a lot of them, were taken to Indian schools where they were subjected to torture and child labor and a lot of abuse, and were effectively removed from their culture to be better Americans, to be better white Americans. But even then, they were being treated far worse than a white American child would be. So this case study is something similar to that, but at the turn of the century, in the late 1890s and early 1900s, Fort Shaw had young women who were playing basketball by virtue of a coach from out east who brought it with her to this school. And so now there's these Indian girls that are a mix of tribes and are seeing basketball as a sport that is allowed by the school as a co-ed sport, in that there's a men's team and a women's team. And the women's team start just trouncing other teams, and they get so good that they end up kind of going on a tour across the US. First, a tour across Montana, and then afterwards, a tour across the US. And they end up playing at the World's Fair in 1904, which was just a really cool story. It's like a Harlem Globetrotters style tour, but at the same time, the book does discuss how before these games, the girls had to perform like tribal dances and that sort of thing. It was a very show off that these are Indian girls kind of mood. And so they had to do dances or songs in certain kinds of dress that, in a way that really was colonial, it used the fact that they were Native American to make money and to also give them an opportunity to ingratiate themselves with and assimilate into the larger, whiter culture, while also to some degree excluding them because they're Native American, that a white basketball team would not be getting this treatment. So it was interesting to see that, and it goes on to say how those women ended up being community leaders within their own cultures. So they were able to go back to their tribes and, using some of that experience, were able to improve upon their communities. But for the most part, because they were at that kind of school, they were removed from a lot of those societies and cultures, subcultures within their Native American tribes. So that was cool. My complaint with the book is that it focuses on amazing women with their legacy as secondary, and then how the outdoors shaped them as tertiary. So the subtitle, How the Outdoors Shaped the Women Who Challenged a Nation, is more incorrect. I would probably reword it, Wild Girls, how the women who challenged a nation were shaped by the outdoors. Because that really puts it in perspective. Wild Girls describes that these were women not doing what they were expected to, what they were supposed to for the time periods they lived in. And then how the women who challenged a nation, being first in that sentence, emphasizing these women had important and long-lasting legacies on the nation, were shaped by the outdoors, thus wrapping up, this is how the outdoors added to their experience. Because a lot of these women were educated in certain ways, and the impact of the wilderness allowed them to tack on that kind of experience to their other experiences. The native girls were playing basketball outdoors, but they could have just as easily been playing it indoors. So their outdoors experiences didn't really shape the fact that they were basketball players. It was that they were basketball players and athletes that made them impactful on a national level. So I think it was poorly named, but otherwise it was a really cool book. There were parts about it that discussed a couple other slaves as well, including poets and authors that went on to write about their experiences. And this was a aspect of the outdoors I don't think is really emphasized much in outdoors literature, but the night sky is explicitly something that is outdoors. And in one of the case studies in this book, and I forget the name of the women being focused on, but it describes how there was a great meteor shower that happened in the I want to say 20s or 1830s, and how that being an event that was seen across the entire United States ended up being a focal point from which people could recall, and that date being known meant that people could describe events in relation to that date. And how one black poet, a woman that went on to be free, described that the plantation owners thought that the meteor shower being so bright and so powerful was a sign of the end times. And so the owners of the plantation started praying with the slaves, and then also telling their slaves the last known transactions for like where this girl's mother was sent to, or where this grandfather's kids, sons, were sent to. And so, as if a way to beg forgiveness at the last minute because of this sign of the end times, so they perceived, they started trying to list off all their sins in the hopes that it might be helpful to the people. It's a profoundly selfish, I think, moment, because, and not selfish from the perspective of the slaves that the women that were once slaves that became free. I don't think it's selfish from their perspective, but only confessing, knowing where these people are, and only confessing when you believe that the end times are coming and you may be punished if you don't let people know, it's profoundly selfish and very evil. But that moment in time was a focal point from which other authors and poets, writers of all sorts, could look back and say, 2 months later I was born and that is how I got my name. Or when I was a girl, I remember watching this event happen, and then the stuff that happened afterwards. So it was just a really interesting book. It focused on, I want to say, like 5 to 10 pages per woman, and the impact they had on the American culture as a whole, and how moments in their lives were shaped by the outdoors. So I liked it. I thought it was really cool from a history perspective, but from an outdoors history perspective, I think it was a bit lacking. I learned a lot of cool things about space and the night sky. I learned a lot of cool things about native tribes and the way girls were able to express what small amounts of freedom they could, how Harriet Tubman did her things. But like I said, it's more about the history than it is about the outdoors. So if you like reading that kind of context, that history, this is going to be a good book for you. But if you want a book about the outdoors, this is maybe not gonna scratch that itch. So yeah, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant.